Well, welcome to the Festival of Pentecost. Protestant churches have not always made a big deal of this festival, despite the fact that it is heralded as the birth of the Christian church. And why the birthday of the church? Well, it's the day we tell this story of how the ministry of Jesus sort of officially became the ministry of Jesus' followers. And here at Trinity, we've been talking about this for a month already, really. We've been exploring stories about Jesus telling his friends how to move on without him. Then even last week, the story of the ascension came where Jesus actually goes away. But after Christmas and Easter, Pentecost marks the most important celebration in the Christian calendar. It is a celebration of the power of the Spirit coming among us and within the church. And to describe that power, we start to use images of wind and fire. And to be honest, these days, it's hard to celebrate wind and fire when Pentecost rolls around exactly at the time of year when we start to worry about things like wildfires. There was a marsh fire out by the diversion at Delta just the other day. Wind creates dust storms. We had one of those recently. It exacerbates flood concerns. It makes it difficult to control those wildfires. So we want to be really conscious of that when we come to our celebrations of Pentecost. Although I suppose it does mean that we are the perfect people to understand the kind of power that comes with fire and wind. This Spirit is powerful. And tending this kind of power asks us to be not frivolous with it, but careful and responsible. I'm not sure that we who come to the church have ever acted like we have a power that could be that dangerous if we don't use it well. We don't feel very powerful, do we? So we think we don't have any power. We've heard this Pentecost story for years, so it feels very tame to us. And yet for centuries, isn't it interesting? For centuries, it has been the abuse of power that has gotten the Christian church into trouble. Time and time again, when the church has done something bad, it's been because they have not acknowledged the power they wield. So what if, when we come to this Pentecost story today, what if we tried to really feel how exciting and how dangerous and how powerful it was for those early followers, so that we might start to get a sense of what power there might still be there within and for us. Think, for example, of that long list of place names that appears in the middle of that Bible story. I'm sure when Brenda was reading them for us today, she was wishing she could skip right over them. She probably thought, Julie, why did you make me read all those? Why do we care about those specific names, and how on earth do we pronounce them? Who are the Parthians? Who are the Elamites? Why do we need to know that there were residents not just from Mesopotamia, but also Cappadocia, or Cappadocia, how do you say that? It seems that these people were people from all over the Middle Eastern world. Okay. Does it help us to know where those places are? It might. Does it help you to know that Parthians and Medes and Elamites were from kingdoms and empires that are currently part of present-day Iran? Does that help you locate it a little better? We've been hearing about Iran in the news. You know where that is. Well, that's where part of these places are. And what if I said some of these kingdoms included modern Iraq, parts of Israel, and the West Bank, parts of Turkey? Cyrene was a Greek colony in the north of Africa. And if you were listening closely, you would have also heard a few familiar names too, like Egypt and Libya. Do you need us to pause? And now we pause for station identification. What's station identification for the church? Jesus, Jesus. This is what we call internet bliss. We can't do a thing about that. It'll do. It's a little wonky. There you go, thank you. All right. Zipping back in, have we lost all train of thought? We're talking about all of these people who have gathered, who are from all of these different parts of the Middle East, places that we don't recognize these names at all, but if we know that they are from places we do understand, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, all of those areas, even Egypt and Libya and places like that. And I think today we might agree that those places, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Crete, Saudi Arabia, are all nations that make up a very combustible political tinderbox. It seems that this has been perhaps true for literally thousands of years. For the Jewish people, the history was even more complicated than what we know of. For most of the kingdoms mentioned had all been significant powers in their own right, had fought for years to rule as much of the land as possible. And some of those were Jewish authorities, and sometimes the Jewish community then claimed victory and their people were the kings. Think of King David, for example. But as we see through much of the Bible, they also often lost those conflicts, and they were exiled or dispersed to various different places. And so the Jewish people were not one cohesive group of people all in the same place. No, they had been scattered all over many, many times to many different kingdoms. And Pentecost was at first a Jewish festival. It didn't start as the birthday of the Christian church. Pentecost comes from a Greek word that means 50th. And 50 days after Passover, not Easter, after Passover, there was a harvest feast that was called the Feast of Weeks. And at Pentecost, exiled Jews would return to Jerusalem from all those different places for worship. Exiled Jews who for over centuries had also come to claim the identities of the places they lived, so that they were Jewish, but they were also Parthians or Cappadocians or wherever they lived. Think of someone like many of you, your ancestors are from, I don't know, Greece or Scotland or Honduras, and you come to Canada and you are both that and Canadian. This was true for the Jewish people. They were Jews, but they were also Cappadocians. And by the time of the book of Acts, most of the kingdoms mentioned had been totally conquered by Rome. So at one point, they had been all their own significant powers, but at this point in history, the list was really a who's who of ancient losers. They were all losers because the Romans were in charge. And Jews from all of these different kingdoms gathered annually in Jerusalem for the Feast of Weeks. And what's funny is, it was the Romans who were most aware of the implications of the power of this Jewish feast of Pentecost. Because they could imagine, what if all of these Jews who came from hither and yon suddenly got together and decided it was time for an insurrection? Made the Romans quite nervous. As far as we're aware, the Jewish people didn't seem to be even aware of the possibility. They didn't feel like they were powerful, right? Like us, didn't feel powerful, so they couldn't possibly have been. Until something happened. Something amazing, something that nobody knew how to describe. And the scholar Diana Butler Bass has this to say about it. She says, if we understand who was there and why, the real miracle of Pentecost comes into focus. All these victims, those demeaned, those enslaved, those brutalized by Rome, stopped being afraid. Those diverse peoples who had been at war for centuries, whose ancestors had tried to destroy one another, suddenly realized that they weren't enemies at all. They finally heard one another. The Spirit broke through, and they rediscovered their own story of a world destined to be shaken by the justice of God in the face of Caesar and the imperial force that had for generations inflicted trauma upon them and their historic homelands through military might and political manipulation, belief in its own ethnic superiority and economic control. Those Pentecost pilgrims realized when the Spirit came among them, they were not alone. They came to Jerusalem believing they were powerless, and they were invited to discover how much power they had together. Well, I was thinking about this, and I saw this really brief commercial that makes the same point. I don't know why I even dare to suggest this, given our technology issues so far, but why not? Let's test it further. And I'll see if we can show you this brief commercial. If not, I'll tell you about it. But let's try, shall we?
Hello? Hello? Would you like another cookie? Oh, yes. Now, there's a very special way to eat this. 文多是这样吃的，首先你扭一扭，然后再舔一舔，然后我们在牛奶里泡一泡。Hey, you've done this before. 哦，你也是这样吃的。
So if you thought you couldn't understand half those words, that was right, because they were in a different language. Two children who find they can communicate with each other despite speaking different languages. In this case, not because of fire, not because of wind, but because they both know the same way to eat an Oreo. Something brought them together beyond their differences to remind them that they were not alone. Now, in the Pentecost story, it pushes it even further beyond the Oreo, because Peter challenges them to realize how much power they had together. And according to the story, if you read on past what Brenda read for us today, it says that 3,000 of them heard Peter's call to action and were baptized and committed themselves to following the Spirit together. 3,000! Can you imagine? There's an Anglican priest, Reverend Dr. James Lemieux, who says that when he thinks of Pentecost, the phrase that echoes in his mind is, "Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines." Now, it's probably because for many years he lived near the Indianapolis Speedway. But he notes that the thing that makes the Indianapolis 500 what it is that great invention called the internal combustion engine. Now, I don't know a lot about race cars, but I do know that fuel ignites, combustion happens, and off they go. Without ignition, there is no movement. Without combustion, there is no race. And with all of our talk about fire and wind, I get why he uses that comparison. Maybe Pentecost is about ignition. And ignition can happen in lots of ways. It can be something dramatic, something that gets you going because it makes you angry or excited or compassionate or on fire with the passion of it. Or it can be way less dramatic, like John Wesley's experience during prayer when he said, "My heart was strangely warmed." Regardless of how it comes, this is a story for ordinary people who receive the Spirit of Jesus and carry it forward, trusting that they can do so because God is with them. There is power there, and they're not alone. We don't have to be perfect. Remember that the leader in this story is Peter. You know, that one who's known in the gospel stories as much for his flaws and his failures and his disloyalty as anything else? That's who's doing this. And we don't have to create the Spirit. Peter says, people, don't be perplexed. Nobody's drunk here. This is God's work among you. So we don't have to do God's work. No, we are called to be open to receiving the Spirit in whatever form it comes. Wind, or breath, or tongues of fire, or an invitation from a neighbor to eat a cookie. Whether it is through word proclaimed, or compassion shared, or community celebration. As people of God, we are called to respond when the Spirit comes among us, to let it ignite us into movement. Yeah, start our engines. And I get it. It is not always easy to be open. Sometimes we are tired, or grieving, or depressed, or angry, frustrated. Sometimes pain and doubt and despair make us feel like we couldn't possibly have energy to respond in a way that would make any difference at all. The good news is that those ancient people at that first Pentecost probably felt that way too. Remember, they were the who's who of the losers. And God doesn't ask us to do anything we can't do. The Spirit comes to imperfect people who are simply willing to move and be moved in the ways that they can. That's all. That's how miracles happen. And the Spirit will help us be who God intends us to be. There's a poet who said, "The breezes that are blowing have a funny way of knowing where you need to do your growing. So they blow change your way, and it's okay. These changes can move you where you most want to be. You may not believe it, but your past is not your destiny. So flow with the winds of the Spirit, go with the winds of change. No need to resist or fear it when your soul is being rearranged." We're not alone. Think of what we could do together. Start your engines. May the power of the Pentecost Spirit move among us all. Amen.